I arrived from New York City yesterday morning at 6:25 and tried to stay awake all day and did a good job walking around Moscow. Tatiana and a guide walked us around. And it reminded me, as I was putting this together, that there is a lot of history in Moscow. Hundreds of years, thousands, And I started thinking about, how does that relate to DevSecOps? How can we relate that to DevSecOps? And what I came up with is a very brief history so that we can lay the groundwork for DevOps and DevSecOps so that you can see where we're going to be going with it for the next couple years. How many people here are developers? Very few. Operations? Security. Okay. I use before DevOps and after DevOps as my cue here. So what we have before DevOps, it started in Japan. How many people know Deming? I need to know where we are here. So, right. This is like the god of DevOps, right? He started conceptually the idea of DevOps. What Deming did is he got called to Japan after World War II to help build a new process for the census in Japan. And when he was there, he gave a talk. And that talk talked about how to get a process flow, how to do a manufacturing flow, and get it to work properly. And the companies in Japan really picked up on the idea, like Sony and Mitsubishi, Toyota specifically. You hear a lot about Toyota when you study Deming. And what he did is he talked about this, all right? The idea that you need to start building the quality of the product at the very beginning so that you don't have to go back and redo what you did before at more expense than you started with. Do you recognize that? So quality starts at the beginning, and that includes security. He wasn't specifically talking about security here, but every time you see quality in these slides, I'd like you to change the word to security in your mind, because it would start to make sense. I see people taking pictures, which is great. You can have this slide deck when I'm done. I've got an email address you can send me. I'll send you the deck. But if they're powerful, please take them and tweet them out. Is there a hashtag, Tatiana, for the conference? Is there a hashtag? No? Okay. So improving quality reduces expenses. Well, there we go. That sounds familiar. If you're in security, this should sound familiar by now in this time in history. The idea of manual mass inspection by a security team is outdated at this point. If your company, if your team is doing manual processing for security processes, you're already at a loss. Because the systems are too complex, things are changing too quickly, and there's too much that can be missed by a manual process. So, we've got here supply chain management. There's three things I'd like you to think about when we're talking about supply chain management. First one is, and Deming actually was much more succinct than this. Deming said, find one supplier. But in the software industry, if we're looking at open source, and whether you know it or not, you are using open source when you're building your applications. 80% of the modern application is built from open source components. What the source code is doing is actually gluing those components together. So what Deming is saying is, find the best source of your open source components. Don't just grab them in general. Figure out who's doing the best job and align yourself with that provider. Not only do you choose the minimum number of suppliers, you take the best parts from those suppliers. So how do you do that? How do you find out what the best parts are? There are tools on the market that will allow you to see if a component is vulnerable, and if it is, what version is available that is relatively secure. So we've got that. Then you've got to track and monitor those. This is the interesting part that the industry is just catching on to. It doesn't matter that you've got one supplier with the best parts. If you put those parts into production and you don't know where they are, and a vulnerability is announced, you lose. It is a game that we're playing here, but it is a critical game. So, minimum number of suppliers, the best parts from those suppliers, and once you put them into your applications, make sure that you track and monitor. You know where they are in your application. How many people remember Heartbleed? You remember Heartbleed? Right. Do you remember Struts 2? Multiple times. Yeah, you open source guys know what I'm talking about. Most people did not know where Struts 2, or if they even had Struts 2 in their application. Because before there was automated security that was actually tracking and monitor components, if you were doing it at all, you were doing it in an Excel spreadsheet. And so somebody had to go and sit for 6 weeks to find out through all of the applications in the enterprise whether or not they were using struts or not. And from what we have heard anecdotally, they probably missed a significant number of those because it was a manual process. As a security professional, I highly recommend that you figure out a way so that you can automate the process of tracking and monitoring, because the next time this is going to happen, and I'm saying it is going to happen, you'll have a way to get to the components that were affected. So, how many people know this book? Please put this on your list. This is a critical book. It's called The Goal from Eli Goldratt. Eli Goldratt created the theory of constraints, which we're going to run through real quickly here so that you can see what he was talking about. This came out in 1984. I read that book, and it immediately in 1984 changed the way that I do business. So, why? Every complex system, and software is as complex as you can get, has a bottleneck somewhere. It has a problem that is slowing the entire system down. And what Goldratt found out is most people, and I hope this word translates properly, but most people are optimizing every single piece of their supply chain. And that is a complete waste of your resources. That's what Goldratt was talking about. Because the speed of your system is dependent upon the slowest part. And when you hear that, you go, well, yeah, that's right. So if I've got simple chain, I've got 5 pieces in my chain, and this is running at 100%, 100%, 40%, 100%, 100%. The 40% part is the one that is defining what your final output is. And that was something that Goldratt did for the manufacturing industry, and we've taken that into the DevOps processes, and you'll see that when Gene Kim comes up here. Here's Goldratt's theory right here. And I don't need to read that for you, but it probably makes sense as you look at it, that you've got to find out where that bottleneck is. And you analyze your system to say, this is what's slowing me down right here. And then what you do is you put your resources and focus them on that part of the system, because that's the one that is driving your output. Subordinate everything else. That means take the resources from everything else and focus on that bottleneck, because that's what the real problem is. Then once that constraint is alleviated, it opens up the bottleneck, and now you've got 80, 100, 100, 100, 100. Now you need to go to the part that's got 80% capacity, right? Running at 80%. So this is the cycle that Goldratt created in his theory of constraints. In his book, The Goal, he talks about a Boy Scout troop. It's a camping, they go out camping. And he realizes that as the boys are marching through the mountains, they're getting farther and farther and farther apart. And what happens is he realizes that the fastest guy is always going to be at the front. And the slowest guy is always going to be at the back. That makes sense, right? And so the whole system itself of those people going through that the camping trip is it gets wider and wider. He stops the boys in the middle of the march and he reverses the line. And he puts the slowest boy in the front and goes all the way back to the fastest guy. So the slowest boy is in the front, determining the entire speed that they're walking. And that's what he's talking about. You want to place your constraint as far up front as you can, so that when you alleviate that constraint, the rest of the team can march much faster behind. You find this interesting? Are you finding something interesting here? I hope. I'm not to the good stuff yet, but this is getting us warmed up. So this is AD, after DevOps, right? In today's world, 10 years later, this doesn't sound like much, because when we have 100,000 deploys a day at Amazon, this doesn't sound like much. This was unbelievable when John and Paul started talking about it. People at Velocity gasped. And when you get the deck, there's a link in there so you can actually see the presentation. When these guys stepped on stage and said, we are deploying into production 10 times a day, heads snapped back. This is unbelievable, right? So the presentation is in the deck there so that you can see that. Then what we've got is DevSecOps Day. Has anybody been to DevOps Days before? Have you been to DevOps Days? So is there one here in Moscow? Does anybody do a DevOps Day here in Moscow? This is regionally organized events where speakers come and talk about DevOps. I mean, I traveled around the world doing this, right? So that was the first time. Patrick Dubois and Chris Bytart put that together in Ghent. They had 70 people show up that first time. And again, it's like, wow, there are people that recognize what we're trying to do. Then Jez and Dave actually created the continuous delivery book. Again, looking back on a historical perspective, you can start to see the flow here. What we've got then is John Willis and Damon Edwards brings the concept of DevOps Days to the United States, and it starts to blow up. Then, how many people have read this? Again, this is an absolute critical book. If you get one book from this presentation, this is the book that you want to get. It's the Phoenix Project. And what Gene did is he took Eli Goldratt's book, The Goal, that we just saw, and turned it into a story about an operations team and a development team working in an enterprise. And he uses the theory of constraints to move through the software supply chain. This is, again, this is critical. It's said in a different way by Gene, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing that Goldratt said. You cannot look at the entire system to determine the speed. You have to find out what your constraints are and then optimize for those constraints. Optimizing locally is not going to do you any good. In fact, that's what the manufacturing problem was that Goldratt was trying to solve. He went to the manufacturing plants and he saw stacks and stacks of pallets because they had made too much stuff at different locations, that were piling into this one bottleneck, and this bottleneck was just surrounded by piles of pallets waiting for work to get done. And we see that in the software industry too, because there's somebody probably in your company, he's the go-to guy. This guy knows everything, right? And everybody goes to him for the answer. If you look closely, that's probably your bottleneck because he or his team are overwhelmed. And that's where you have to emphasize. We have to optimize that location within the structure. I see people nodding their head, yes, that's good that you recognize that. You're even laughing, it's so recognizable. That's great. In 2014, the first annual DevOps Enterprise Summit, Gene, who wrote this book, started the DevOps Enterprise Summit. This was the first time that all of the major enterprises that were using DevOps came together under one roof and told their story to each other. It's an absolute eye-opening experience to see how the major banks are using DevOps, how the healthcare system is using DevOps, how Target, how Nike, how Starbucks is using DevOps. Then in 2016, my partner Derek Weeks did the first annual State of the Software Supply Chain report. That's when it launched, and it started looking at the industry as a whole. What patterns are we seeing? So in that supply chain report, I want you to keep these numbers in mind as we're moving forward here. 31 billion downloads. At the time we looked at that, we said, oh, Jesus, that's incredible. There's 31 billion downloads of open source components annually being called from the Maven Central repository. Then we started looking at it. There's a problem because 1 in every 16 of those downloads had a known vulnerability in it. When developers are just grabbing what they need, I need a logging framework, and they're not actually analyzing whether it's vulnerable or not, or has an announced vulnerability. That's even worse. It has an announced vulnerability. There's a real problem there. And we can go through this. Keep those numbers in mind because I'm going to walk through it yearly as we go here. Then the first annual All-Day DevOps Conference. How many people have heard of All-Day DevOps? Good. I'm the co-founder of that. So thanks for being here. This was an interesting concept because we do it all live online. There's no physical location. Derek and I came up with the idea, and 90 days later, 90 days later, we had 13,400 people globally signed up. And that's when we realized, okay, this is now a global phenomenon. DevOps is here. It's huge. So we did 15 time zone, 15 hours, 54 sessions. Everybody was delivering live from their desktop wherever they were. So we were able to get some of the best DevOps stories in the world in front of the rest of the world. Then the State of the Software Supply Chain report in 2017 was released. We're looking at this. 52 billion downloads the next year. That's how fast this growth of open source and using open source is going. There's a lot of data in here. You can download these reports. The links are in the slide deck. Just look at that just to kind of get a glimpse of what's going on. It's really, really impressive when you look at the numbers that way. Second annual All-Day DevOps Conference, we had 30,000 people register. So from 13,400 to the next year, 30,000, we had doubled in audience. Again, DevOps was permeating throughout the culture as far as software supply chain was concerned. What I noticed is, because I'm the one that helps look at the figures after the event is over, I looked at it before. What the speakers were, we had a call for papers out, and I looked and said, what do people want to talk about? And this was the first year we had actually seen this. And I cannot stress this enough. If you are starting a DevOps initiative or a DevSecOps initiative, you do not start with the tools. You start with the culture. You have to get a buy-in from the company, from the developers all the way up to the C-suite in order to get a DevOps initiative started. And if anybody in here, you're sitting next to anybody that has done DevOps, I think they will confirm that. Because if you don't get buy-in, by the time you get halfway down the track, there's nothing left because you don't have the support you need to make it happen. Then Gene, Jazz, Pat, and John did the DevOps handbook. Another thing that was huge, software supply chain report comes out again. Breaches increased 55% in 1 year. What has happened is the adversaries that are actually hacking into the systems, breaking into the systems, have found something that most people aren't aware of. And I'm going to show you that in a second here. If you take nothing away from the slides with all the research on it, this is the one right here that will make a difference in how you do things. The exploit time has decreased by 93%, meaning where it used to be you had 45 days to fix a vulnerability that you had found, that has been decompressed by 93%. Third annual DevOps, all-day DevOps, it just keeps growing. This is the 10th anniversary year of Patrick and Chris in Ghent for DevOps Days. And again, if you're a company here in Moscow and somebody has not produced the DevOps Days, jump in. Because what we need is these are local organizers producing these events and bringing in regional speakers. Plus, you can usually get an international speaker or two to come to something, especially in Moscow. Everybody wants to come to Moscow. This is great. It's been fun. So, this is how quickly DevOps Days spread around the world. The first year they did it, there was one event. Next year there was 4, 6, and 5. And then all the way up to this year, there are 72 of these events around the world, all run locally. I'd love to see one here. I'd love to see one here. It looks like DevSecOps Days is on track to do that too. So, why do we need security as a part of DevOps? What is DevSecOps? And why have we put that sec in the middle of the word here? If you don't know Shannon, you want to put her on your radar. This is somebody that you want to know. I call her the godmother of DevSecOps. She actually wrote the DevSecOps manifesto, right? And she defined why we need it. And it's important to realize this, that it's no longer just the security team's responsibility to do security. Everyone in that software development life cycle, in that supply chain, has to be responsible for the security at their point of contact. This is inarguable. We can't argue about this anymore because the security team can't do it. Not only can't they do it, they can't stand on the outside of the process and let you develop your software and then nail you at the end before it's supposed to go into production. This is what Shannon had in the manifesto. But basically, the main thing that she's trying to get at, and which we all picked up on, is that security must be a part from the very beginning, must be part of the system that's building the software, not something that's tacked on. How many people are on a security team that actually works daily with the developers? Oh, that's great. That's very good. That's very good. Okay. I produced the DevSecOps day, the workshop at RSA conference in San Francisco and Singapore every year. And so as we were producing that, we built up the audience. Now we have, it is actually a confirmed part of every one of the RSA conferences. You guys know John? Yeah, John Willis is a good guy. He wrote something because the DevOps people were saying, why in the hell are you putting the word sec into DevOps? You're just confusing everybody. And John's response was, hey, get over it. It's just a name. But what John learned, and you can take this back to your team with you if you really want to sell the idea of DevSecOps. When John would go in to talk to executives and he'd talk about DevOps, their eyes would glaze over. They just bored them silly. But when he said DevSecOps, he put the security in there, they lit up because they understand what security means in a general sense, not to the level you guys do. But when you say that this process is going to help security, that's when the checkbooks start coming out and you can get your project done. So John and I went to London with Chris, and Aubrey was there, and we actually did the first DevSecOps days in London. And then we did one in San Francisco and one in Singapore that first year. Epic failures in DevSecOps. I was sitting at a bar in Singapore, and we had just finished an event, and all the speakers were sitting there telling war stories, saying, oh, I completely destroyed a system by doing something. And we all started laughing and said, why don't we write a book about this?